Hello, it is the 8th of January, 2016, and this is episode 38 of the Unseen Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Carr, and this is our first episode of the year, 2016. We're glad to be back after a 3-week hiatus. Tonight's topic will be a bit controversial. I know we're often quite skeptical on this show. We often address certain conspiracy theory topics with a certain amount of derision and laughter. But tonight I'd like to take on a topic that is a bit outside the scope of mainstream science, but still is something that can be addressed seriously and soberly. And tonight we will take that tack. Joining the panel tonight is from Hawaii, Ted Rowe.
Aloha.
Ted, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm the executive director of the National Aviation Reporting Center on Anomalous Phenomenon, which is an organization that studies aviation observations and incidents involving unidentified aerial phenomena. I've been the director thereof for about 15 years. And we've learned a few things, and I've got some questions, and I'm hoping maybe your panelists and I can engage on it and see where it leads.
Great. Also, tonight we have Jeff Boerst.
Hello, how's it going?
And Nick Nielsen.
Hello to Paul, to the panel, and to Unseen Podcast listeners.
And Mike Bohler.
Hello, everyone.
And I don't believe James has joined us yet. No, we are expecting James Garrison later, so he'll show up when he shows up. Now, this is Ted's first appearance on the Unseen Podcast. And Ted was posted in the topics thread that we always start about 3 weeks before the show that he was interested in talking about unidentified aerial phenomena. Now, Ted, you got to admit, right, there's been a lot of pseudoscience and a lot of woo-woo around this topic, right? Do you agree with that?
Oh, I would agree with that heartily. Yeah, there's no question that there's dissonance around the topic, and I think it interferes with a rational engagement of the subject, really.
Yeah. We talk about the Fermi paradox a lot here on the Unseen Podcast. It's one of our favorite topics. And the whole premise of the Fermi paradox is that the Earth has never been visited by what Ronald Bracewell called the superior galactic community. And yet, we never really question that because it's kind of interesting to assume that it's true. But
yes,
once in a while, we want to step back and say, is it really true that we never have been visited? Is there any hint that there's been a visit from someone with a far superior technological capability, either now or in the past, in the Earth's past? So Ted, I know your organization specifically looks into some pretty strange stuff. Can you give us some example of some of the more interesting things you've found?
Well, sure. Basically, what we do is we look at pilot reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, and we're specifically interested in aviation safety-related incidents where pilots felt that their safety and the souls on board were endangered by the encounter that they had. And what we learned was that amongst the things that happen are concurrent effects on equipment failures, temporary and permanent equipment failures. And we learned that the observations of the phenomena involved in those cases always involved a ball of light. It didn't involve a structured object or anything else. So we put a lot of focus on trying to understand what these balls of light might be and how they manifest and how prevalent they are in the aviation literature. And they are quite prevalent. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what the mechanism behind them is. That's just one example of the things that we're looking at. The problems that we have are certain cases present in a very provocative way with respect to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or the idea that some of these unidentifieds might be artifacts of extraterrestrial intelligence activity in the Earth domain. But for us to actually look at that and make a good decision around it, we need more information. We need to have a better understanding of what an extraterrestrial incursion might look like, and how to score our cases against that possibility. And right now that doesn't exist, and there hasn't really been a rational discussion around it, although a number of the research teams in the world have tried to call attention to certain provocative cases. It's pretty much fallen on deaf ears. I don't think the French team or our team has ever said that aliens are here or that any of this represents aliens, but people need to look at all of this a little more closely. Science should look a little more closely at all of this. And,
now, at least in the U.S., scientists don't want to look at this, right? Because that's a career-limiting move. Maybe in Europe, it's better.
Yeah, the conversation seems to be more open in Europe. We presented before the French Air and Space Academy, and they have a UAP research team within CNES, their space agency, and we participated in one of their workshops, and we've had a working relationship with them in whichever incarnation they've been around in since 2000. They certainly have aviation cases as well, and a lot of our cases have a lot in common. Which is another thing. We have all of these case files that have been released by all these countries, and if you do a comparative analysis, you start seeing certain commonalities among certain types of cases that beg a closer look, if for no other reason than to just rule them out, but we should take a look at them. I don't think it's wise to just discard this stuff with an opinion and not go more closely.
Now, one of the cases that I actually read a report that your group was involved in was the Chicago O'Hare Airport case.
Yeah.
Now, at that point, the report, although it was quite lengthy, was fairly inconclusive, right?
That's the way I would call it. Yeah, it's not a hill to die on as far as making a case around extraterrestrial incursions. I think there's better cases.
How many actual eyewitnesses were there to that one, by the way?
Oh, there were a couple of dozen eyewitnesses, a ground crew, ramp controllers, a number of folks on the ground saw this thing. There was a taxiway crew, I believe, ferrying aircraft around the terminal there, and they also saw it. But there again, it's not the strongest case out there. It just points out that these cases can manifest in Class B restricted airspace, and they can cause problems. That we need to be a little more mindful about unidentifieds and the hazards that they might represent, even if it is a small percentage of cases.
Yeah, one would wonder what I kind of look at it like there's going to be some really big event that's going to basically kind of like the Chelyabinsk or whatever was the big meteor that everybody caught in Russia, and then suddenly everybody started taking it more seriously. Maybe we better start looking for these. Yeah, there was another event, but there was an event with meteors that was similar that made the world kind of take an eye, So I think
Go ahead.
Well, I think he's talking about the Chelyabinsk Meteor, or the one that was caught on multiple cameras.
I'm not sure if that was the one, but that actually started it. But there was one. There might have been earlier than that actually made the world kind of take notice, and the world government start. Okay, we're going to have to start looking for more of these at near Earth objects. So I'm thinking, is it going to take some horribly, just an event where lives are actually lost or something in an air mishap to actually have the people take this seriously? I mean, out front seriously rather than behind the scenes, like I know you said, Ted, in your interview with Marcia Barnhart, you were saying that off the record, government people take this, or like, well, okay, yeah, we don't necessarily dispute it, but officially they don't. I mean, what's it going to take to get this seriously looked at, you know?
Well, it takes doing what we're doing, and then pushing for a critical mass from the ground up, working our demographic in the aviation community, and working with getting to the point where we can get the attention of the ICAO in a serious way, and it's a matter of building data, and normalizing data collection between different points, and then working with them, the international groups like CEFA, the Chilean group that we have a research agreement with, and we have an agreement with the French group 3AF Sigma 2, and we work closely with GPAN and with others when asked. And we're on speaking terms with all of those folks. It's in its infancy right now in terms of peer review and the development of this as a science, but it's all coalescing. It takes some time, and it's going to take some funding. We definitely need some financial infusion to help this process move along. Yeah. I would hope that it wouldn't take a blatant event that would just scare the bejesus out of everybody and get them thinking about ET incursions. But honestly, the subject is deep and complex, and it really hasn't been given its due. And that's kind of what I'm asking for, because I'm in a position as an administrator in a UAP research team looking at cases that in some cases in some examples are rather provocative, but there's no larger context to deal with it in there. I have nobody to take it to, my suspicions, and there's no scale, no way to score a case against the idea of what an ET incursion is or might look like or how we might detect one. I have a hunch that it would probably be very subtle, so we wouldn't enjoy an embarrassment of evidence, and there'd be a lot of judgment calls involved. It's not going to be the kind of thing that gets resolved to an absolute scientific certainty. It's more of a tactical, intelligence-related problem, just in my opinion,
now,
from my position.
Yeah. Now, Ted, I won't ask you to speak out of school, but are you, how to put this delicately, are you in touch with anybody in the United States government who's interested in this issue?
No, I can't say that. In 15 years of doing this, I mean, I don't understand all these tales of men in black and everything. I've never been approached or asked to stop it or been obstructed. In fact, we helped interview the U.S. Air Force on uncorrelated incursions into U.S. air defense zones as part of a government hearing that originally began as a UAP examination, but was altered by Department of Homeland Security about halfway through. But no, I've never had any contact with the government other than briefing the ASRS, the FAA's aviation safety reporting system analysts, and participating with some administrators that work at NASA.
Okay, now one of the cases I read about was the Japan Airlines case.
Mm-hmm.
Now there was an FAA administrator who kind of came forward, blew the whistle a little bit on that one, or am I getting that wrong?
No, you got that right. It was John Callahan. He was the director of aviation accidents and investigations for the FAA, I believe, and he got wind of the Karaoke case that you're referring to near Elmendorf, and went and collected the materials from that case. As he puts it, he was kind of in a race with other government elements to get a hold of that material. I met him in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. back in about 2004, and he produced a number of these original materials around the case that were a bit tattered, but it was interesting. So, yeah, that was John Callahan.
Okay.
We did I mentioned a briefing for the FAA's ASRS group, and their director, Linda Connell, at the time, I don't know if she's still directing, but she came out publicly in the media regarding our efforts and said that they get reports from time to time that reflect the things we're interested in.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Now, when a pilot, let's say an airline pilot in the United States, sees something he doesn't understand, or I should say, he or she, are they required to report it, or is it there used to be some kind of requirement not to report it, wasn't there?
Well, this is kind of where the irrationality around this whole topic seems to be saturated, and at least in the aviation side, and creates problems for me in terms of just trying to get a straight trajectory on the research. But Janap 146, a joint Army, Navy, Air Force publication, maybe it was 126, I think it was 126, instructed airline pilots to not to publicly report any observations that they had or that they reported through the service system or face a penalty. And at the time, we didn't have satellite coverage of the planet. This was prior to 1978, and it was used to airline pilots and others were basically forward observers who would see bomber formations coming over from Russia or flights of missiles or whatever. And so they were used sort of as an intelligence gathering force and were warned not to speak of anything that they reported to the military. This had a chilling effect, and pilots stopped talking about things that they saw in the air afterwards, and their managers continued that tradition. And while the reports haven't decreased at all, people talking about them did for quite a while. We're seeing a little bit of a turnaround there, but I'm sure that the stories we get are the tip of the icebergs in terms of what people have to tell us about.
Do pilots tell you that do they preface their reports like, I'm not supposed to talk about this, but, or is it more like they're completely open about it?
It just depends on the pilot and his own level of confidence and how nervous he is about what he has to say. And the circumstances that it occurred under, if you have an F-111 pilot who's talking to you about a mission from 1982 or something, and it was military related, he might be a little bashful and glad that he waited. And if you have an airline pilot, for some airlines here, they have a fairly open culture, and they can talk about pretty much whatever they want to. And then other airlines, it is verboten. You're setting yourself up for a psyche valve if you cause people to question their confidence in you as a pilot.
Hmm.
So there's a kind of a stigma around the subject, and again, it's a part of this irrationality. The FAA expresses it really clearly, and they tell pilots that if they've seen a UFO, that they can report it to a public UFO reporting center or a private aerospace business, but they don't want to know about it. And that, to me, that's irrational in that, they're obsessed, and rightfully so, with aviation safety, but there's just one category that they don't want to talk about, and they aim pilots away from them. So the information flows away from the aviation system, and except for organizations like mine that try to circulate it back to the aviation system, it's lost as far as aviation safety planning and mitigation goes.
When it comes to safety like that, how many near misses would you say that were like really, like if it was something other, if it was a known object, they'd have gone nuts about it and like pull that in, not only the air crew seeing it, but, have there been a lot of near misses where passengers actually have taken a notice?
Well, yes, there's been cases where passengers have been injured when pilots put in control inputs to avoid a perceived near midair collision. A lot of these cases involve either near mid-airs or a loss of separation type incidents where separation closes under 1,000 feet or is perceived to be under 1,000 feet. And sometimes the trajectories on these things can be really dynamic and multiple. They can move in different directions. They can move rather quickly. And there's kind of a scope of appearances, but we don't have it down in terms of nailing down the profiles on them. They seem to be intermittently detected on radars. They're quite dynamic. In some cases, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as being intelligent, and then other cases you suspect the opposite. Well, we have one case on NARCAP Technical Report 12 that has us all kind of scratching our heads, and I don't really know how to write the paper around an argument that might be an intelligent artifact or not. But it's unusual. It was a ball of light that pulled up under an airliner and paced under the tail for a little bit and then broke away. A group of astronomers were on the ground, and amateur astronomers that were setting up, and they managed to get a series of photographs of this incident, and we've had it in our case files with their names associated with it. They were willing to be publicly associated with it, and nobody ever said we got you on it. And the case itself is provocative. I don't know how to engage that other than, for what it looks like.
Yeah, I saw
and that's
that.
the problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Totally. Yeah, I saw that that in that image you're talking about on the website, and it's obviously some really big thing right there under the airplane, and in cases like that where you say the passengers actually get hurt too because of the pilots trying to avoid things. Now, aren't there investigations that have to happen because of that? And if so, do they just completely skirt, I'm guessing, the possibility that it's something weird?
Yes, that's pretty much the take on it. The NTSB allows for multiple investigations, and the idea of majority and minority reports. And but at the same time, when a pilot's career is involved and there are issues, a lot of times those incidents never make it to the public domain. The FAA manages the punitive measures or whatever ends up being taken, and you never actually get to hear about that story, or the guy sounds like a wacko when he finally does tell anybody. So there's a lot of dissonance inside the aviation system around the subject too, which is another sign of an irrational engagement. If we just went about it and we're thorough and consistent in our logic and just do the work, we can get to the other side of this and we can determine what it is we're looking at. My guess is that it's some poorly not documented natural phenomena, and then for these provocative cases, I'm wide open because I don't really have a larger context to measure it against. And that's been really the failing in this conversation all along. Is the investigations are really good, in a lot of cases. There's really good documentation and good work, but there's been nothing to compare it to, no way to say, well, we kind of think that an ET incursion could be like this or like that, and hey, this is looking a lot like that. It's subtle. It seems like it's almost covert, and the activity that this thing demonstrated clearly seems to be outside the parameters of known natural phenomenon. Perhaps we should have some suspicions about this and set it aside with a definite maybe and pay attention a little more.
A definite maybe, yeah.
And when you're talking about things possibly looking like they possess an intelligence, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, is there some sort of emotionary call and response, like the plane moves a certain way and it responds, or is there a way to tangibly explain that?
Well, sure. If you look at that case, that technical report 12 that I was talking about, you have the phenomenon. It's tailing the aircraft at a good distance, and then it exceeds the aircraft speed. It pulls up underneath the tail of the aircraft, and then it holds there. No dynamic buffeting. It isn't pushed up against the airplane. It's holding its own, and then it leaves at an oblique angle in another direction. And so is that intelligent behavior or not? It's borderline, it's indicative with the multiple trajectories and it's and so on. It's indicative that it's probably not a natural phenomenon unless there's perhaps some kind of a dynamic relationship between aircraft and their environment that creates these luminous phenomenon.
I think maybe magnetic fields or something interacting or something to make it come right to the aircraft. See, that's the thing.
Yeah.
That's the weird thing.
Right, and we have a lot of examples of this sort of thing, of these balls of light pacing aircraft, and sometimes showing up in multiples. It's more than one sometimes, and then we have the intermittent failures on onboard systems associated with some of these observations. Navigation fails, autopilot fails, communications fails, this kind of thing. Oftentimes temporary, and then when the event is over, the systems return to a functional state. So there's a lot of question marks around all of this. So we haven't really, like I said, we haven't really built a context to measure this against. So there's all this argument and dissonance over whether they are or whether they aren't. And what we really need to be doing is asking ourselves, what would we expect it to be like? Without anthropomorphizing, ask ourselves what an ET incursion would look like. What are we expecting it? What are we expecting that to be like? And does any of this stuff quack like a duck?
Right.
And then you can work it through.
Right. Mike, you have a
Yeah. I wanted to ask a quick question. I'm kind of new to your organization and what you're doing. Can I get maybe a rundown on your methodology on how you look at these different cases?
That's a quick question.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And do you start from it's a UFO or it's an unidentified phenomenon and work to something, or do you? I mean, you're not saying this is a extraterrestrial alien. Now we got to fit the pieces.
No. What happens basically is we get a report. Excuse me. We get a report. It's hopefully it's timely in that it's happened within 2 weeks of the report. And if that's the case, then we can go to the FAA with a FOIA request and request air traffic control audio and radar hard copy, encrypted hard copy, and then we can recreate that radar data using hand algorithms and just write it out and remake the radar plots. And then we go ahead and we interview the pilot and any other witnesses carefully. And let them tell us what it is they saw and what they think they saw. And then it's a matter of assessment. It's a judgment call as to whether or not if it was truly unidentified or whether it was misidentification of natural phenomena or human activity or something else. So pilots are subject to illusion and delusions, and we need to be able to make sure that they weren't being taken in by certain reflections or whatever might have affected their perceptions. And then we just write it up. Sometimes there are aviation cases like this technical report 12 that I was referring to that are actually photographs. They're ground observations of phenomena that are near aircraft. And in this case, this technical report, I doubt very much the aircrew knew that the phenomenon was there. And if I was a Department of Homeland Security person, I might suspect that phenomenon is ordnance and take undue cautions of another kind. So there's a lot of holes around the types of observations we get. It just depends on what comes to us. If we get a report of an airport incursion, which seems to happen once or twice a year, that you get the reports thereof. We try to dig in and look, but we only focus on U.S. aviation cases or cases involving U.S. aircrews. We have a relationship with the ASRS group, so if anybody reports there, we tend to be flagged for those cases as well. The actual investigations, and our chief scientist is a perceptual psychologist and a first chief of the Space Human Factors Office at Ames Research Center. Very good with visual acuity and a lot of experience working on the UFO question. And he did some work for NASA back in the 60s, helping them kind of divine whether or not UFO reports were reports of internal phenomena that pilots were dealing with as part of their physiology, or whether they were actually external observations. And Dr. Richard Haynes, came down strongly on the idea that a lot of these were external observations, and that they begged a closer look.
So you're really taking a good, nice methodological look at. You're taking the report. You're seeing how you're looking at all as much as you can.
That's right.
So, and you're also assessing the pilots, maybe fatigue levels or whatever, all that kind of stuff that could play into a.
We're looking at reflections. We're looking at misidentifications of aircraft traveling on other air tracks. We had a report one time the guy was dead on, for when and he saw it and where, but it was another airplane passing under him about 1,200 feet below him on a different heading, and so he was absolutely right in what he thought he saw, but what he really saw was an airplane.
Can you break down? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, can you break down the percentages of how many you think are cases are misidentifications? How many of them are like psychological issues? How many of them are actually top secret government things? And how many of them are just, I wonder if there's something more to this? You know what I'm saying?
Well, and those are all good categories in terms of breaking it down. Well, actually, the way we try to break it down is more in terms of historical observations and then current cases that we can actually do an investigation on. The historical cases tend to be pilot anecdotes. We ask them for copies of their flight logs if they wrote anything in their logs on that particular day when that incident occurred. We look for their testimony and we document very carefully what it was they saw, knowing that that's all there is, basically, is documenting those cases. There's no way to go back and resolve it one way or another. In a lot of situations, some cases you could go back and look into astronomical data or other things and perhaps resolve them as prosaic. But it's really the cases that are current and that have enough information to give the pilot some veracity that support his narrative, whatever that is. And frankly, even in the best of situations, there's not a lot of evidence when you're dealing with something that flew up to an airplane and left it, and somebody saw it. But what we are learning is that there are certain ways of categorizing these observations. For example, the balls of light seem to be, oftentimes pilots will see these and they will call the air controllers and ask if the air traffic control can pick them up on their radar sets. And very often they can't. Very occasionally they do. But most of the time they don't. So here we are, we have a visual observation that can't be supported by a radar detection. It doesn't take away from the case at all. It just tells us that perhaps the characteristics of this observation involve intermittent radar detectability. We're dealing with unidentified. They're unknowns. We don't know what their capacities are, but I think it's reasonable to think that you can see something that isn't detectable on radar. In terms of breaking these things down, like government projects or this sort of thing, we do look carefully at the locations and where these events kind of take place, because if they're near known government reservations, we tend to be a bit careful. And if we really think we're dealing with something that's a black project of some kind, we just back away, but hands off. We have a number of people who are experienced on that side of the fence, and their judgment helps guide us in making good decisions that way.
How about aerial or atmospheric phenomena like the red dwarfs and the blue jets and all those? Are there any more of those that have been determined as valid things?
Well, pilots tell us what they see. The whole idea of blue jets really came about from pilot reports to begin with, and science really kind of ignored them. They said, well, there's no way lightning's going from the top of clouds into the upper atmosphere. That just isn't happening. And but a couple of atmospheric physicists, I think, continued documenting these pilot reports, and at some point they started setting up cameras, and lo and behold, they were able to capture photographs of blue jets and that whole family of observations. So pilots were right about that, and they talk about some other things. Then we should look carefully and listen carefully just to be sure that we're not missing anything.
So there are other possible things in that category that are still being looked at then, or?
Yeah. There's an idea called extreme ball lightning, for example, which are really big ball lightning that have a huge potential. You don't want to hit one with an airplane. They're not going to get out of your way, and they could vaporize an aircraft without too much trouble. Then there's some other ideas floating around out there in terms of rare atmospheric phenomena that are poorly documented but coherent. And that's the question, because a lot of these things, we know ball lightning, for example, has a fairly short lifespan of, 5 to 7 seconds. But these things have tens of minutes of duration. They'll pace aircraft. They'll they seem to have coordinated movement at times and variable trajectories. So really getting them pinned down is difficult. We do see some comparisons with Earthlights, what are called Earthlights. These orange balls of light, for example, are common in the Earthlight literature. But whether they are what pilots are seeing at altitude as orange balls of light, I don't really know how to test that or find out, other than to note that there's some commonality between the two observations. But yeah, there definitely are some things that could account for some of these observations. But then some of these observations, they either are what the witness says they are, or they're not. And that's kind of the rub where we're at in terms of UAP research teams, because we're basically the only ones looking at this stuff. If nobody's looking to see what is manifesting, they wouldn't necessarily know that we were having an incursion by a non-human intelligence either.
If you had more funding, Ted, would you say instrument some aircraft or what would you do?
Well, I'd certainly empower the research side a little more, but what I would really do is focus more on shoring up the interaction between these various research teams and developing a more of an international research arc, shoring up peer review, and coming up with some means of publication that so that we can get the information together and get it out there in a way that it can be digested properly by science, and we can get the answers we need, even if it is a SWAT. At least we've structured everything in a way that the system can engage it. That's where I would go. And then as far as actual research goes, there's a couple of things that I'd want to take on in terms of direct research and field research. And there are some locations and places where these phenomena seem to be recurring, and I'd like to look a little more closely at those situations for starters. And I'd like to see some kind of change in recurrency training with pilots and some sort of centralized way for them to move that information somewhere where it gets looked at with the seriousness that it deserves. I think there are a number of aviation safety officials that are in agreement with us that the matter needs to be engaged more fully, but it's just going to take time for us to build that momentum.
Is it common knowledge among pilots that you guys are the ones to report things to?
Well, I'd like to think so, but we really need to work more on our outreach and get further out there. There's a lot of pilots that know about us, and more coming around all the time. My emails pretty steadily. I have emails from pilots fairly steadily talking about cases or situations or just being glad that there's somebody out there that's looking at this particular thing. Often they have relatives that saw them if they didn't see them themselves. I remind one time I was part of this congressional hearing. We met with some of Podesta's people in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Michikaku was there to kind of vet our materials. This was all brought on by an incident over restricted airspace over the nation's capital. It included an Air Force pursuit. So Tom Davis, who was the head of the Committee on Government Reform at the time, caught wind of it and wanted to learn more. So they pulled a few of us together to kind of brief some congressmen and their aides. And Dr. Kaku was there to kind of vet our materials and look things over. And it was very interesting hearing from these aides how their relatives or they themselves had seen things that fit the category of high strangeness, as it were, and they were looking forward to some kind of engagement on it that would help open up the conversation a little more and keep it rational, but get somewhere with it.
Right. Okay. Let's back up a little bit to a bit higher level. And talk about, you made some fairly nuanced points earlier about how we wouldn't really know what to look for in an ET incursion, or we might just be guessing, I think, if I'm summarizing you correctly.
Yeah.
Now, Nick, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about what an ET civilization might look like. What if it were actually here with us, present? What do you think it would look like?
Well, I think we have to separate what it would look like from the evidence we would have of it, and the evidence we would have of it would be the sort of things that's being pursued under SETA, SETA, the Search for Extraterrestrial Artifacts. And as you know, there have been a wide range of various efforts of listening for what could be a Bracewell probe or something like that, or looking for something that was in orbit or somewhere in our solar system. So observations of artifacts or observations of signals, something that was unambiguously technological and intelligent in origin would be pretty much what people are looking for when they're engaged in the search for extraterrestrial artifacts.
Right. Well, I mean, I'm gonna have to make a confession here. When Dawn started to close in on Ceres, I was really hoping for smoking gun evidence that that somebody had been there before we were. I don't think I've gotten that, but although there's a lot of weird stuff on Ceres, none of it is clearly not natural.
Is there any reason you were expecting that from that particular
Well,
encounter?
I wasn't so much expecting as more hoping.
Well, excuse me. Was there any reason you were hoping for that for Ceres as opposed to, say, Europa or any other Mars or any other place in the solar system?
Well, it's a large asteroid. It has a lot of water on it. It would be pretty easy to extract resources from. And that would be now, of course, that requires making about 1 million assumptions about what advanced technology would be interested in doing once they got here. But none of which shows assumptions I can validate. But in order to be right, we have to be wrong a lot. So
indeed, but the way to be wrong limited a lot of times, and what you is to one would want design experiments from a scientific approach. I understand that there's very little funding for experiments. Experiments that would very likely what you can do with converge upon unidentified aerial phenomenon. Earlier, you mentioned the blue jets, and once people started taking that seriously, now we have photographic evidence and some good science behind blue jets, and it's not a big mystery anymore. Yeah. And there's no reason that there shouldn't be more things that we do not yet currently have in the science of atmospheric phenomenon that could be documented, and a real scientific theory based on evidence could be forthcoming.
Sure.
Right. Well, I mean, there's more lesser well-known things in the atmosphere that are still we're trying to nail down, like where all the electric field comes from, and I mean, it's just and that's not because it's particularly weird. It's just that it's a very complex process, very complex phenomenon. So there are going to be things that are not well understood at any given time. But when you're every natural phenomenon that we study is a phenomenon that doesn't know it's being studied. It's not smarter than we are. If we're observing a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee may be pretty smart, but it's not smarter than we are. We can observe its behavior and figure out experiments a way to understand it. But what if we're observing a phenomenon that is smarter than we are? Do we have even a chance of applying the usual scientific process?
Well, see, that's kind of where I'm stuck with right now, because I mean, if you're going to talk about an intelligence that is orders above our own, then its behaviors are not going to necessarily appear rational to us. Its activities and the things it undertakes and the way it goes about doing them may not be clear to us at all. And then if on top of that, beyond subtle, they're covert. Perhaps they're warlike. Perhaps they're not in space to be explorers and everybody's friend. that they are driven by self-interest or of some kind or another. You can spend a lot of time on the what ifs, but my point is that it's a tactical problem. A lot of our best minds have said that bad things that can come of the presence of a superior technical civilization. Hawking, I think, was commenting on that a while back, that we really don't want to encounter an extraterrestrial civilization if we can help it. I don't know if he's right or wrong in that context, but if we have that kind of nervousness about it, and we're getting thousands of reports a year of a provocative nature, some of which seem to hold up to scrutiny, what is? Are we really? Is it reasonable to expect an embarrassment of evidence? I mean, if we're looking at a ball of light and we have no idea that technology can be a ball of light, then we're limited by our lack of imagination, and we're being exploited throughout the time that we aren't able to make a determination one way or the other as to what that really is. And this is kind of the part of the problem. Bracewell probes, all of this is all very good, but we would look for evidence of that. Well, we're getting reports of things that might be exogenous probes that aren't being examined, or they're being opined away without actually being engaged. And there is no higher authority to say, well, this case is worthy and this case is not. Is it only the case of interest, the one involving a manifestation over a military base, or do we care about the one that happens out in the countryside somewhere? Which cases do we ignore if we want to have a proper stance of vigilance? If we think we live in an inflating universe, then we live in a populated universe that's pretty old. We don't know anything about the colonization of galactic habitability zones. We don't have any idea of what space migration is like, or what we can expect, what kind of ecosystem it might be out there. And I think it's prudent to be a little bit watchful, a little bit careful, and think these things through a little bit before we're confronted by them.
Mm-hmm. Now, if they were really hostile, I mean, wouldn't we already be, we'd be food, right, already?
Well, Paul, there's all kinds of hostility. You know, an 800-pound gorilla walks into the phone booth you're at, and, you know, you're going to modify your behavior. You know, you just do. That's hostility. He's in control now. And quite frankly, any superior technical civilization that shows up in the Earth domain owns it, because we don't have anything to say about that. We have no control over that at all at this point. Our best HEL lasers are what, 5-mile range, you know? We don't have the ability to defend the planet, and hostility can stretch out over decades. Covert behaviors that we would call hostile behaviors may not be necessarily wars. Exploitation doesn't necessarily have to be overt, you know. And then you're dealing with mindsets that are alien, so they're foreign to the way we look at things. They probably have the ability, I would guess, to exploit our perceptual weaknesses and take advantage of our cultural weaknesses, our intellectual weaknesses, like the dissonance around the subject of whether they're here or not. And I'm not saying that any of this is happening, but what I'm saying is that we don't really have any reason to be confident that it isn't happening. And when we have so many cases that aren't really even being looked at, much less any judgment being pronounced upon, we really should be more careful. If these are civilization-ending events, we should be paying more attention.
I don't think it's really fair to say that these, as was earlier said, that these aren't given their due or they're not being discussed. The thing is, this kind of material is wildly popular. I myself had the misfortune of attending a UFO convention once, and the people in the audience swooned when they were told all this stuff about unexplained aerial phenomenon, and it's enormously popular. It's fodder for science fiction films and novels and the like. The point is the context in which it is treated, despite being popular, is not the context that is going to get it scientific attention. The context is going to The context that's going to give it scientific attention, or if you were in scare quotes, serious attention, is going to be if the millions of people who are interested in unidentified aerial phenomenon got together, they could raise a substantial amount of money and they could fund a rigorous scientific study that everybody would have to take seriously, even if it didn't, demonstrate the existence of extraterrestrials or anything like that. But the fact that this hasn't happened is a serious weakness, and people, the scientifically minded people, want evidence that's more than observation. We need something that's publicly available that can be studied by a community of researchers.
Well, there's certainly, you're correct in all of that. I couldn't agree more. And the community, the paradigm known as ufology is quite divided. And there are charlatans and exploitive personalities involved, as well as just deluded people. And a lot of money does move around with it, and they are entertained quite a lot. We've made it a kind of a rule to avoid UFO conferences in general. We do a couple of them every now and then, but they really have to be narrow and focused in scope. But there are research teams that are engaging this in a serious way. We're writing good white papers. We're doing good documentation. The nature of the phenomenon itself doesn't lend itself to repeatability. I can provide cases to you that involve not only witness testimony, but involve radar detections and other things. But if it's just opined away without being acted on, it's not really worth anything. If it's not being considered in the context that it presents itself in, it's not worth terribly much. The Air Force came out in '68 and pretty much said that everything that they'd found out about UFOs was that there was nothing to it, which if you actually look at the cases in their files, their research was laughable, and some of those cases are frighteningly provocative. They vastly understated the number of cases of interest. They said 2% or something like that, and the Battelle Institute, who helped with an analysis of their work, publicly stated that. But an examination of their study showed that about 22% of the Air Force cases were very well documented, and people who were qualified to know what was there weren't able to divine it. So here's 20% cases, 1 in 5. That are interesting and documented and opined away, not engaged. And then you have the AIAA on the other hand, with a very powerful science team in a complete dissenting role, saying no, this is not science. This work needs to be looked at more. It could lead in a lot of directions, but it's premature to be making pronouncements about it. And they carried on their studies for another 5 or 6 years before finally they ended their engagement. But they didn't come to a conclusion. They just stopped doing the work. So we've got science teams. I've got 3AF, which is a consortium of aviation and aeronautics companies in France, and they have 10 working groups, and one of those deals with anomalous aerial phenomena. And the problem here is, I want to make this really clear to everybody that UAP is a broad brush. It can mean natural phenomena. It isn't a given that making a case for the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena is an argument for the presence of extraterrestrials. And in my case, what I'm saying as an administrator of one of these organizations is that I need some better tools to make a determination on what cases should be looked at. We have provocative cases, but what is provocative enough, and then who needs to see it? And where do I take it to? Who are you going to call? To quote an old movie.
I know you say your group mainly looks at aerial phenomenon, and aerial phenomenon are fleeting and hard to predict when they're going to happen. But then I know there's a lot of ground-based phenomenon that areas where they have recurrent lights, the orbs on the ground. Now, are there any is there much corroboration with your group and other groups that focus on aerial phenomenon with researchers that are actually on site at places where they can get physical, like image documentation and things about ground things, and try and correlate the two and see if there's any corroboration?
Oh, sure. Mr. Erling Strand has run a program you might be familiar with at Hesteland, Norway, using automated systems for about 20 years now, documenting a site that has a lot of unusual lighting.
Really? What kind of instrumentation is he using on his device?
He's got an automated system that takes stills and maintains video. It's at Hesteland.org, HESSDALEN.org. And it's a very good long-term instrumented study. There was a secondary team from Italy that went there, and it was a joint study called the EMBLA project. And that was led by Massimo Teodorani, who's an astrophysicist, and they wrote a very good paper on the results of their work at Hesteland. And now Massimo's he's done work at other sites, including a site that I've been to in Arizona that has very unusual light phenomena as well. That I wouldn't be so quick to say it's natural. I don't really know what it is I'm looking at, but it's there. And he's been there as well, and they've actually started an initiative to set up some instrumented remote camera systems to do some documentation at these other sites.
Oh, like the Arizona site? Is that the one where they have the 3 blue lights or the 4 blue lights up on the hill that you were describing to Marcia Barnhart?
The red lights on the rim of the canyon. Yeah,
is there any, I was wondering about that. Is there any way that if someone can actually get up to about where those occur physically at about the time that they actually have been documented seeing and, getting close to them?
Oh, sure. They're only about 50 feet off the ground and about 50 feet from each other. There's 5 of them in a row, and they recur in basically the same spot. So it's just a matter of being there and set up. And it's a bit of a project to get out there. The environment itself is quite inhospitable for about 6 months of the year. Not safe to be in. It's just the heat is just too much. But yeah, there's that. I talked about setting up EM traps. Just little switches that would flip in the presence of certain static charges, this kind of thing. Lightning strike detectors that golfers carry around, trigger out there. But I'd like to see like a magnetometer out there and a few other odds and ends, and yeah, I'd like to put a laser on one of those lights as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But then the funding—that's what you need, is the funding for all that. Can you actually get underneath? Right. Have you literally stood underneath them and looked straight up at them before? Has anyone done that?
I haven't been exactly under them, but I've been at the foot of the canyon looking up, which is probably below them another 35 feet or so. But yeah,
that's pretty close.
Yeah, really close. Yeah, less than 100 feet, and they're right there on the rim of the canyon, and that's just one of several things that seems to recur there, along with transient phenomena that don't seem repeatable, repeating or have a frequency of occurrence. So it's a very unusual place. People have been there for a very long time documenting it. There's a lot of rock art on the walls. It's quite extensive and it's quite old. So it's been of value to people for a long time. There are some other human activities right around the site that also seem to be indicative of something unusual. And I can't help but think that doing some work in these sites would be very helpful as far as getting a better handle on the transient phenomena that pilots are dealing with. If we can get some models of how these things hold their coherence for so long, that would be helpful. And the work at Hesteland, there's a lot of good published papers there. I think one is called a long-term study of the Hesteland phenomenon. I think that's the one that Teodorani wrote.
So have there been much, have you looked at, do you see much correlation between the ground evidence and things? Like, do you see like patterns or something like that with aerial and ground, or do you think there's a correlation? Or
I don't know how to actually prove that. To say that the orange balls of light seen at ground level are the same orange balls that pilots are seeing. I have seen aircraft flying in the presence of what looked to be amorphous plasma discharges that were orange, and not far from the site in Arizona, actually. So, and I'm sure that's natural phenomena of some kind. There's something about that, a mechanism at work of some kind there. But there are other things that we see there that don't leave you with that sensation. That you feel like you're looking at things that are just really, it's alien. You don't know how to put a handle on it. We were at high noon looking out over this site, and we looked kind of downrange. I saw a bright flash, and we got the camera on it, and it turned into what appeared to be a rectangle of lightning in a fairly, defined rectangular shape. And it moved, as it moved closer towards between us. There was a discharge between it and the ground, and it moved a little further, and it disappeared. And then we looked at it 30 frames per second, and it was actually a single line of lightning vibrating up and down fast enough that made you see, that your eye would see a rectangle. And then it did discharge, and then after the discharge, there was a ring of lights that lit up around the whole site. And we turned the camera off, not seeing those lights. I'm sure the CCD saw it. It was probably infrared, just out of human visual range, so that the camera could pick it up. And I don't really know what to make of that stuff. Again, there's nothing to gauge it against in terms of how do you call this non-natural phenomenon, or how do you make the case that it deserves a closer look because it might be something other than we suspected. That's the whole problem. We don't have a context to actually talk about these things rationally. We've got UFO conferences, which are nothing more than what I call UFO-tainment. There's the rationality is just not present there, and anybody who wants to protect their image and actually do good work in this field isn't helped by those activities, that paradigm. So I don't really know where to go. I'm looking for sort of guidance in a way in terms of how to think about extraterrestrial incursions, and how if we have cases that are provocative, what can we do with them? It seems to me that if we have a lot to lose by not detecting these things and being agile about it, if and when it happens. And right now, there's no detection. I mean, most of the planet doesn't enjoy primary radar coverage, much less. I would think that any sufficiently advanced civilization could get to ground level here and roam at will.
Clark's fourth law, right?
Yeah.
Any sufficiently advanced civilization get ground level and
right.
all they want.
So anyway, that's what I'm just trying to get to. I mean, the UFO community aren't going to contribute to the answer to these questions. This needs to come from people who are thinking globally, who understand the potentials of non-human intelligences, and can develop a way to assess and agilely engage incidents that might be leading to that.
Okay, well, that raises the question of, again, I guess it may sound like a broken record, but a non-human intelligence, I'm not going to say an extraterrestrial intelligence, non-human, do we have any way of understanding how that would look different from a natural phenomenon?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Does ball lightning look like technology based on general relativity? I don't know. I don't know what that tech would look like. Are there ways of organizing technology that are different than the ways we do it? I would think there are. How would we notice them? What would be the indicators in our immediate environment of their presence? Will we see gravitational distortions? Would we see temporal distortions? Would we see, EM distortions of some kind or another, or could they be extremely subtle? You know.
Well, I mean, if we go back to Clarke's third law, right? Indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
Magic always leaves you perplexed, right? You see something, you say, what just happened? How did that happen?
Right.
But that's relying on a very subjective human impression, which could be wrong about lots of other things as well.
The behavior of other species often leaves us very perplexed, and that it points to the only thing we can do on Earth to study the question of other minds is to study those minds that are most different from us, which we share the planet with. And there's been some great research on cephalopod intelligence and avian intelligence that people have started to conduct this actually in a very explicit way. Saying that this is our next best thing to studying alien intelligence is to study the minds of octopi and crows.
Sure. Actually, John Lilly first couched that idea back in the early 60s when he suggested that SETI should be spelled CETI, communicating with extraterrestrial intelligences, and we should start by working with dolphins and cetaceans. And of course, he led an effort in that, and it continues to this day. And that would be helpful to a point, but all the intelligences we're dealing with here are terrestrial intelligences. They're mammalian intelligences for the most part, or avian. They aren't. I mean, alien means not like us, and probably not compatible. I mean, if you were an alien, you came from a planet where your evolution gave you 3 fingers instead of 5 on each hand, where perhaps you weren't able to see the sky because of heavy cloud cover or something. What would your science look like? What would your mathematics look like? You would come to a lot of the same conclusions, but you might go down paths that open doors that we aren't aware of, that combine principles that we hadn't really thought were combinable, that perhaps overcome certain kinds of problems that we don't consider beatable at this point. And I think that if we're going to be prudent about this sort of thing, and we're getting all of these reports, that there should be some level of engagement, some level of intellectual dialogue that would somehow elevate this conversation a little bit beyond UFO nuts, for lack of a better word.
That's a good term.
Yeah. Well, I've had to deal with the fallout of ufology for 15 years and trying to get a straight conversation with people about very real incidents. Pilots write up reports on these things, and they put their careers at risk to get the word out. Excuse me. And because of the crazies, the narcissists, the self-important, a lot of our message falls on deaf ears. We're kind of thrown out with the bathwater when it comes to dealing with my group. If I say I deal with unidentified aerial phenomena, they automatically equate me with alien chasing, and I don't think we even have the word alien on my website once. And I've made it a point throughout that we don't talk about that. We don't even talk about UFOs unless the phenomenon it's described was an object. Because we want to be accurate. We changed the terminology to unidentified aerial phenomena in 2000. It wasn't being used in America at the time, and it caught on like wildfire after we announced that we were open and we were doing business using that vernacular. And so we've tried to bring some objectivity to the conversation, and I'm still trying to keep it. There's a whole 50% of our database is basically involves objects, along with these unusual light phenomena. And so nearly half of what we have are objects that have unusual qualities and properties. And if we're going to address those things scientifically and thoroughly and with a consistent logic, then we need to talk a little bit about what they might be and discuss, what we suspect those situations might develop as, so that we can have a framework to
take it to the next level if needed, or at least be on a readiness footing. I don't think that it goes away. I don't think the potential goes down over time that these incidents can occur. I do understand that we're talking about a scale of time that's much larger than even the age of our civilization for the expectation of visitations, but we have all these reports, and I think that if you're going to be thorough and consistent in your logic, then you work the reports, you work the data, and so you have the answer. You don't pontificate and say, well, it couldn't be extraterrestrial civilizations because the theory of special relativity doesn't allow for that. Therefore, I'm not going to look at this case involving a B52 crew and radar data and. That isn't rational. It's not a rational engagement. And I'm looking for a rational engagement. That's all I'm trying to do. Wherever the data leads, I want to go there appropriately and rationally. And right now, it's not a rational environment, and I'm just trying to see if we can leverage that conversation a little bit.
Right. Yeah, you pointed me to that B52 case, and I have to say that I went and looked at the Blue Book report and found a mistake in it right away.
Yeah.
The moon was not up when they said what was seen might have been the moon. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not saying I know what that case was,
right?
But it's unfortunate it wasn't investigated very well.
Well, that's the whole thing. We have all of these cases. We have a lot of this kind of thing that aren't really being gathered up in the right way and looked carefully at. And part of that is because we haven't really put our minds to what ET incursions might look like. We've got Star Trek, we've got we've got the Vulcans making first contact with Earth and blah blah blah. But we need a real conversation about this. Something that's a little bit closer to our what reality might be, rather than what we might fantasize it to be like.
Right, and I'm all for having that conversation, and I hope we can continue it. So I think we'll kind of wrap it up here. But what we typically do is we go around the panel and get everybody to sort of state their final impressions, and we'll end up with you, Ted, at the end.
Great.
So we'll start with Jeff.
Okay, just had to unmute. Yeah, well, I want to preface this by saying since I was a kid, I was all into the aliens, and I know they're here, and and they like strawberry ice cream, as one report says, of an alien that was somebody in the U.S. government. I think something from 52, Area 51. I mean, I was sure up until about 6 or 7 years ago. I started listening to Phil Plait and reading Phil Plait and different skeptics like him, and getting more into the scientific end of it. And then it's like I flipped a coin. All of a sudden, that's ridiculous. People who think that are loony. There's no sense in even investigating it. But now, with this, I mean, literally with just this discussion that we started online a couple of weeks ago, that coin's kind of standing on its edge right now. It's like flipped back halfway over. I'm like, okay, there is something weird going on. That there are things that people like government and officials in the Air Force see on a regular basis, like you're saying, especially the aerial ones, but even on the ground, is making me consider all of this again, not as definitely yes or no, but as a what. We need to find this out. And one good thing that's happened in the scientific community that's giving me hope that this some watershed event might happen to open up the floodgates, so to speak, for all this is the possible when a few months ago when they started discussing maybe there's a isosphere around this other star because of the weird light interruptions coming from it. So right then, for about 2 months or a good month or so, a large amount of the scientific community was actually saying, hey, maybe out there, let's look at this. But that hasn't turned around down onto the Earth yet. But yeah, I'm glad I've got involved in all this, because I'm definitely going to be starting to look at this from another, even a third point of view now for hopefully many years, and be able to follow the research you and other people are doing to see what can be made of it all.
Outstanding. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Mike Bohler, any final impressions?
I'm actually, again, I have my hopes that there are civilizations trying to contact us, or that there are extraterrestrials, and the UFO community has let me down. Okay,
That's true.
but from what I'm hearing, this is the first time I've actually heard someone looking at strange phenomenon in a rational sense. I mean, usually it's if there's the phenomenon like these lightning, the lights around planes. Oh, that's aliens. That's how they're checking us out. Automatically going to it. That's
right.
kind of like my question was: Are you trying to start from we don't know? Let's look at the evidence and pursue that, because I liked hearing that. So I know there's at least one organization that is taking a very sensible approach to looking at this stuff, and I'm actually very impressed right now, and I'm still hopeful that there's aliens out there. But it'd be nice that if you can get more research and maybe even find out. I'm kind of I've been thinking through this, maybe it is just a natural phenomenon that we've never seen before, because it's an aircraft and it's creating a static discharge and hitting a magnetic anomaly just right, a ball or whatever. But actually getting the research to say there's something going on out there, and that's what I get from this discussion. There's something out there that we really got to look at. And because the UFO community has made it sound so it's uncool. It's made it uncool to look at this stuff. I mean, hopefully you can at least hopefully this can maybe jar a few scientists and saying, hey, maybe there is worth to start maybe exploring this. We don't necessarily have to. Because you're not jumping to the conclusion, oh, this is all aliens doing this. So I really like what I'm hearing here.
Well, thank you.
Okay, Nick.
I think that we can say that there are a lot of reports, but I don't think that we can accurately say that there is a lot of data, because there haven't really been any scientific observations. Now, that was noted earlier when someone said that these phenomenon don't lend themselves to repeatability, and they're what historians would call idiographic rather than nomothetic. But in the spirit of constructive suggestion, I would like to say that one thing, and mindful of the fact that research costs money and there are funding constraints, one thing that could be done is to hold a contest for people to submit an experiment design and have to try to promote it as widely as possible and get people to suggest rigorous scientific experiments that could pass peer review, that could address some of these phenomenon and actually produce scientific observations that could command the attention of the scientific community, instead of leaving it at merely serendipitous observational reports.
Okay. And Ted, except for me, you get the last word.
Okay. Well, I appreciate everybody's commentary there. It's all taken in good spirit. I hope that you all come away with this idea that there are some folks looking at this in a serious way and looking for some consistent logic, not so much from ufology but from science. I'm hoping too that the conversation will evolve a little bit so that we can actually address some of these things. And if it turns out that there's no there, then that's great. We've done what we came here for. And if there is a there, then we've been prudent. We've looked carefully, and we were able to overcome a great challenge for humanity. So hopefully, as the process develops, we'll get a chance to talk about this more. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ted. And let me just say that I've had a few reflections on this topic in other forums, including my blog, the Dream of the Open Channel, and I think I'll refer you to that in the show notes. The show notes will be at unseenpodcast.com. Go there to learn more. We'll also have links to Ted's organization and the various things he discussed today, including that intriguing B52 case that took place near Minot, North Dakota, back in the 60s. And, there are a lot of cases. It's true that no one case is a smoking gun that says that the aliens are here. And if you do not want to believe that aliens are here, there's no evidence I can point you to that I can say you were wrong. So what I could say is that I think in my opinion, that nobody really knows whether the Earth has ever been visited or not, and it's an extremely difficult hypothesis to formulate because we don't know anything about what an alien civilization would look like in reality. If you to think about how our civilization looks like now and how it looked like 200 years ago, and try to compare them and try to understand how it would look, I think you find that it would be very difficult to define the observables that we would provide. So, and that's just from one. That's within the same species. So, I'll have some more thoughts on this soon. I want to encourage everybody to again go to unseenpodcast.com, comment on this episode, comment on what we have said tonight. You can do that right at the blog post. You can also send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com. We have a listeners community on Google+. We have a listeners subreddit on Reddit. So there's plenty of places where you can speak your mind and let us know what you think. I certainly understand skepticism in the face of what the ufological community has produced over the last 60 years. That is not surprising. And the skepticism is not only understandable, it's probably helpful. So now there's a couple other things I want to talk about tonight real quick. The Unseen Podcast has its first patron on patreon.com. Her name is, I assume it's a lady. First name is Linda. Hold on a second here. Linda. Okay. I'm sorry, Linda. I may be pronouncing this wrong, but Linda Sadiq is our first patron. And I would encourage you to go to patreon.com/unseenpodcast and sign up. We don't want you to give us a whole lot of money. There are other charities far more worthy of your funds, but if you can spare, say, $1 a month, after you've contributed ample funds to causes like, say, the SETI Institute or Alzheimer's research or cancer research, Doctors Without Borders, other good. But then if you have another $1 left, we'd like to have it. And it would help defray our costs to keep this podcast going. So please feel free to go over there and see what you can do. The most important thing you can do for us, though, is share this podcast. Let us know what you thought. If you liked it, let your friends know that you liked it. And we will be back next week. I think next week it's going to be a completely different topic. Not quite settled on yet. If you want to have input to that topic, you want to join the panel, you want to be on a panel, you can do that. This is an open participation podcast. Send me an email at unseenpodcast@gmail.com and I will get you started on that. So, once again, this has been episode 38 of the Unseen Podcast. It is the 8th of January, 2016. I'd like to thank my panel one last time. Ted Rowe. And Ted, you still there? He's not there. Okay. Jeff Boerst. Thanks, Jeff.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hey, thanks. No
And-
problem. Thank you for having me.
Mike Bohler. Nick
Thanks for the
Nielsen.
opportunity, Paul.
Unfortunately, James Garrison never was able to get with us tonight. He intended to, but as it often happens, circumstances
Or he was
intervene.
abducted.
No, actually, something even more traumatic. An angry 6-year-old. Music has been by DJ Spooky. I'm your host, Paul Carr. Again, go to unseenpodcast.com for more. And by the way, if you want to hear some of what Nick Nielsen's had to say lately, go to wowsignalpodcast.com. He's done a couple of Boerst episodes for us lately. So thank you and good night. We'll see you next week on the Unseen Podcast.